I think it's probably the bulb types in this side of the office. But
it looks very angelic, like the holy, like the holy angels are shining down upon you.
I can try and find a different set of light.
No,
it's fine. It's fine.
I've got a standing light I can point at me.
No, it makes you look like a saint that just came out from heaven.
It's a nimbus of light. It's quite numinous. We'll go with it. Thanks. Thanks for doing this.
Yep. Up to you.
Doctor, welcome. This is Greg.
Howdy.
Hi. I just we're launching this podcast today before I get shadow banned on Instagram into the because my TikTok account actually got deleted. So if you don't know me, I'm a kind of anti-war activist and anti-imperialist in general. So should we just jump right in?
Let's do it.
Yeah.
All right. I am going to do. Okay. And
use a dog.
All right. Hello and welcome to this, our inaugural episode of Colonial Outcasts, a podcast all about things anti-imperialist. I'm one of your hosts, Greg Stoker, former U.S. Army Ranger, ex-actor, ex-guitar repair technician, currently in between jobs, and currently an anti-war activist. So I'm like super bohemian right now. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Mark Wayne, a reformed Christian Zionist turned pro-Palestine supporter after living in Israel at the age of 18. And he's a totally chilled out dude, at least now. And our first guest, Professor Liam O'Mara, who will be introduced post-haste. Thanks for being here, Professor.
Hey, happy to be here.
So this might be a rocky start, a lot of kinks to work out, but we're trying to get off the ground before I'm shadow banned on social media into the outer darkness. So today we're talking about Palestine, obviously, as if there is any more pressing issue right now, with a focus on genocide-enabling ideologies that seem, at least from an outsider's perspective, to permeate every aspect of Israeli social and political societies, their origins, and how those ideologies can eventually, if ever, be dismantled. So without any further ado, Mark's going to send the intro, and then we're just going to dive right into it. Also, we do not have to use TikTok-friendly language, so just let it rip however you want to.
Don't say unalive.
Yeah,
I've actually done that in conversations with people when I'm talking to them face to face. I'm like, Palestinian being unalive. I'm like, what the fuck?
What are you talking about?
Which was bizarre.
Oh yes.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, I'm not gonna lie. I'm a little nervous, but I'm gonna try to. So I wrote a little introduction for you, Doc, and I'm gonna try to get through it. I'm gonna read off the paper here because I'm not confident enough in my, spitballing skills. So, Doc, I can't express how honored I am to pick your brain for an official podcast. While Greg has been kicking ass dismantling propaganda through his insanely effective videos on IG, I have been in the shadows engaging on TikTok lives where I stumbled onto you. And just watching your lives on TikTok, I was just overwhelmed by your vast wealth of knowledge. Your bank account is full of amazing insights and nuances. When I was actually able to be on one of your panels, like I said, I was starstruck. I felt, like I said, I think I told you this, I felt like a teenage girl in the early 2000s who just met Justin Timberlake, and I was like, oh my God.
I don't know what that feels like. Yeah,
I don't know what I feel like. I imagine it feels like what I felt like with him. So I can tell you. Anyways, I can't think of a better way to christen our recording than with you. You're the perfect champagne bottle that we're breaking on the hull of this anti-imperial ship for its maiden voyage. I thought you'd like that. Hey, I'm trying to be poetic. Okay. Let me stretch my skills a little bit. All right?
Yeah. All right.
I'm not trying. That sounded a little douchey, or what?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, just keep rolling.
Okay. So just to give our audience a brief introduction so you can further elaborate on Dr. Liam O'Mara. You're a history professor. You ran for the House of Representatives in California, 42nd Congressional District. You were a candidate in the 2022 midterm election, born in California. You're a historian, cook, information technology support, and longshore worker in the past. And I believe you speak a couple languages, Arabic and Hebrew. Am I wrong on that?
I read quite a few languages tolerably well. I'm conversationally very weak in a lot of them because I don't I never practice things like that, and it just doesn't
Yeah.
seem the way my brain is wired. I can kind of get by on the streets in a few, but
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not comfortable. But give me a newspaper and I'm fine, because that's how I studied them.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. So you're pro-Palestinian, pro-humanity, and anti-imperialist, anti-racist, anti-fascist, and anti-bullshit scholar. In a lecture hosted on your YouTube page titled Neo-Fascist Dog Whistles, you accuse prominent conservative figures of racist overtures, stating that mainstream conservatives are increasingly embracing white nationalist positions and Nazi-style symbolism.
Yeah.
So you run your YouTube channel, Office Hours with the Mad Professor. You have long, in-depth lectures on TikTok Live, ranging from history, religion, and of course Palestine. You have a lot of allergies too. I noticed. I've noticed in watching your very insightful lectures, you're allergic to ignorant generalities, false history, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and just bullshit in general.
Yeah.
These misunderstandings that you have declared war against are the lifeblood of imperialism. They have kept us as humans separated from each other through ignorance as their stronghold over us, using very effective propaganda. That was until people like you decided to dedicate their lives to dissecting and dismantling all the bullshit. You live and thrive in the nuance. That's one of my favorite things about you. You live in the nuance. That you're all about the intricacies of history, the interconnected relationship, and you hate generalities because they just create this broad paintbrush that people who are not as learned just swallow up and just run with. So all right, so I'm gonna stop kissing your ass right now. All right, so well,
if I can add a couple of things on there. For politics, it was actually in the 2020 race, not 22. Where
okay,
fairly
got
well,
something wrong.
but I was honestly, the whole thing was like a fascinating experiment in social and political psychology. Can an autistic academic anarchist with long hair and a beard actually run for office and do well? And I did better than any previous candidate had against the incumbent in that district. So I was happy enough with that. But the fact that I'm a fairly outspoken anti-fascist did get me into trouble eventually. So whatever, I decided to drop out. I was honestly shocked that I got as far as I did. So it was kind of a fun in that way. I like that you mentioned allergies too, because that was honestly hilarious. It's because I actually do have a lot of actual allergies. So when you said it, and I noticed he has a lot of allergies, I'm like, really? Was that obvious in some of my videos? Because I actually, so fun point of trivia, I'm allergic to plants, animals, chemicals, dust, some seasons direct sunlight even. I mean, there's a lot of things that set me off because I have a defect in my peripheral nervous system. So allergens actually cause searing pain for me. So I don't care. I don't mind. I just get by because, hey, it could be a hell of a lot worse and life is good. So, but it's quirky. Right. So and this is my allergy season. Like the 6 months out of the year, like from fall to early spring, are just terrible in California for me. So when you said that in the dead of winter, in the worst period of my allergies, he has a lot of allergies. Like, shit, where was that obvious on YouTube?
You haven't been doxxed that badly.
Leave it to me to say some stupid shit and have it actually be real and actually be like, oh,
yeah, no, it was great. It was great the way you used it, and it was actually kind of funny because it's ironically very true. I have severe allergies.
That's hilarious. Yeah, that's hilarious.
All right, guys. So I think since October 7th, I've made a concerted effort to kind of dismantle the IDF military propaganda that they're showing out, because that's my background. So we wanted to start this off with a clip from an IDF soldier. This is from February 6th, so it's recent. It wasn't right after the attack on October 7th. It's still this pervasive mentality that these soldiers in Gaza are still actively exhibiting after 4 months, and he's bringing in like history, making references to the Hittites, and we'd just like your initial reactions on just however you want to respond to it. Let me pull it up real quick. And if you guys are listening to this podcast, you might want to look at the video, because this video is subtitled in English, but it's in Hebrew. So, wait a second. Add to stage.
הנכבה עומדת להיות זיכרון מתוק לעומת מה שמגיע אלינו. אנחנו עם ישראל, עלינו נאמר כאיש אחד בלב אחד. אנחנו כמו איברים שונים של אותו גוף. לכן יהודי שנרצח בבארי גורם ליהודי שגר בקליפורניה לבכות, וליהודי שגר בכפר סבא לעלות על מדים. אנחנו בניו של אברהם אבינו שניפץ את כל האלילים בבית אביו, שגייס 318 לוחמי עילית כדי לשחרר את לוט מהשבי. אנחנו בניו של יהושע שכבש את הארץ הזו מ7 עמים שונים. זוכרים את הכנענים, החיתים, היבוסים? כולם נעלמו מהעולם, ועם ישראל פה כדי להישאר. אנחנו עם של גבורה ומסירות נפש למען העם והארץ. ייזכרו בשמשון הגיבור, יואב בן צרויה, דוד המלך, אבנר בן נר, בר כוכבא, יוסף טרומפלדור, חנה סנש, יוני נתניהו, אביגדור קהלני, ועוד עשרות גיבורים שמתו במתקפה האחרונה, ואת סיפורם עוד ננציח על לוח ליבנו. חזרנו לארצנו אחרי 2000 שנות גלות כואבות, שרדנו את השואה והקמנו מדינה מאפר הקורבנות. האום חילק את הארץ הזו לשנינו, אבל להם היה חשוב יותר לשנוא אותנו מאשר לבנות לעצמם עתיד. והם ניסו להילחם בנו פעם ופעמיים ושלוש, ובכל פעם מחדש הם הפסידו, בכל פעם מחדש ניצחנו, בזכות האמונה בהשם ובזכות גבורתם של חיילי ואזרחי ישראל. אסמאעיל הנייה, יימח שמו, המנהיג שלהם, אמר את זה הכי ברור: אנחנו אוהבים את המוות כפי שהיהודים אוהבים את החיים. הם לא רק חיות אדם, הם גם טיפשים. אפס של תקווה הם נותנים לעם שלהם, רק שנאה ודם וגהנום. הם לא מבינים עם מי הם התעסקו. פתחו על עצמם את שערי הגהנום ואנחנו רק התחלנו. הנכבה עומדת להיות זיכרון מתוק לעומת מה שעומד ליפול עליהם. תתחילו לברוח, כי צה"ל בדרך. הם לא מבינים.
Okay. It's a lot of bold statements there.
Yeah.
And the reason I brought it up, it's just so widespread throughout these military forces.
And realistically, widespread throughout society. There's nothing terribly unusual or uncommon here. This is the strength of rhetoric here has been building up for decades and decades. And the longer this goes on, the worse it's likely to get. So I'm honestly happy that more people are paying attention to this kind of stuff now, because when I started teaching this stuff 2 decades ago, people didn't know anything about this at all. It was just shocking, and it's still problematic for a lot of people, because as soon as you, like, I find that no one's going to complain when I trash Islamists and I point to some of the worst aspects of their ideology. No one bats an eye when I point to the anti-Semitism in Hamas's first covenant. Nobody bats an eye when I talk about their atrocities. But as soon as you mention the Kahanists or, religious Zionist terrorists or anything else like that, people are like, what? This never happens. I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? This is just open a freaking newspaper in Israel. This shit happens. Because we don't talk about it. So the radicalism is simply not present for a lot of the diaspora, and certainly for much of the Christian world.
Right. Yeah, and I think from an outsider's perspective, I guess we have a limited view or limited insight, especially for someone who grew up in America who's never been to the Middle East or Israel or Palestine for that matter, like how widespread and entrenched this, what I would call fundamentalism, is in the society. Because like
there's a quick point on fundamentalism, like on how this works here, right? Overall, Israeli Jews are more secular than American Jews. Many Israeli Jews have never set foot in a synagogue. It's not a big part. Religion is not a big part of their lives. But for a small minority of them, they are hard fucking core, like really into this shit. And the folks that are in that camp, they often have extreme interpretations of the Bible that are every bit as problematic as the most fundamentalist Christians are. You've got a lot of that in this actual video. Much of the perspective outlined there is commonly believed, but literally false. The bit about Abraham smashing the idols in his father's shop is from a midrash. It was written like thousands of years after the time it was supposed to have set. It has nothing to do with anything. It's literally a children's story. So it's cute. It's a nice story, and it says something about the evolution of monotheism, but it's not an event. to point to. And then more difficult for a lot of people is the fact that the conquest by Joshua of the Canaanites is literally a myth written many centuries later to justify Judah conquering the northern kingdom of Israel once the Assyrians had pulled out. The United Monarchy part, the initial conquest under Joshua, the successor to Moses, all of that is political mythology. There is still an antique people here. Like, the Jewish people do originate on this land. But they literally evolved out of Canaanite culture, which makes them actual siblings to Lebanese and Palestinians. But the myth of an outside conquest, which I think it's fascinating that they point to it, because it kind of makes them sound like they're the outsiders in a way. Because, you know, if you take the story literally, this is one of the things I think it's hilarious about fundamentalists in general. The Abraham story has Abraham coming into the Holy Land and making a deal with a Philistine king who already was there. So the way that they're writing the story kind of makes the Palestinians indigenous and the Israelis the outsiders, but they still run with it. So it in some ways, it seems like it almost would undermine their position, but they still run with it because they love the conquest aspect. They love the power of it, that they took it and it's theirs and no one can take it back, because that's what he's using this for. He's arguing that we have force, no one can take it from us. But the actual truth is that they're all indigenous and descended from exactly the same people.
Well, that's a great segue into what one of our first questions that I wanted to get. Like, this whole Palestinian and Israeli conflict, there's a lot to unpack there. But we were trying to figure out how we're going to prioritize the questions for you to cover, because we don't have a lot of time. I mean, it depends on what your schedule is, but my approach was I wanted to take all the typical bullshit bullet points that we commonly see, and I want to tear them all down. Even the ones that may not seem important, but the ones that you constantly hear, I want to nail these one by one. And one of those is in the indigenous nature of Palestinians. Now, I've been saying, I'm going to first tell you what I've been saying for 15 years, on this conflict. I've been preaching on the mountaintops for this, but nobody takes it serious. It hasn't been an argument that's been brought up a lot or a point. And I don't know, we'll see what your perspective is on this. There was a genetic study done of Palestinians. And what's amazing is that the actual Israelite origins of Palestinians. And for my research there's a rabbi who did this. My research had led me down this rabbit hole of it, and it made a lot of sense. So during the diaspora, when they kicked out the Jews in AD 70, not all of them were kicked out. The Romans left behind a remnant, and to be the tenders to the olive groves, to supply the olive oil for the Roman Empire. So they gave them a deal. Look, you can either go in the diaspora with your buddies, or you can stay as slaves and tend to the olive groves. Well, those were the Israelites, around the Israelites of the time, who were alive around the time of Jesus, roughly. Well, obviously, with the Islamic conquest happening and different groups moving in, you have a lot of conversions going on, a lot of intermingling, converting to Islam, converting to Christianity, back to Islam, back to Judaism, back to Islam, a lot of things going on. But at the end of the day, the intermarrying and intermingling, what do you have later? 2,000 years later, you have Palestinians who are part Jewish, who have ancient Israelite blood. So now the reason why I think this is an important point to make is because under the Zionist logic, if we're going to go down this ethno-nationalist road, all right, let's do that for a second. Let's take a detour off this ethno-nationalist road, because I want to defeat them on their own grounds. Their own grounds is that, okay, this land belongs to the Jews, the descendants of Jacob, according to the Bible. Okay, well, even under that auspice, Palestinians qualify because they're part Jewish. And it's an often neglected point. And I think I had heard you say it in one of your videos or one of your lives that you had outlined that. But I wanted to know what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, it's actually a good bit more complicated than that. So if you don't mind, I can take a couple of minutes and walk through the origins of the populations.
Yeah.
And we can see how they really relate to each other.
Yeah.
There are two major routes of migration out of Africa. Into the Levant is one of them. So people have been moving in and out, in back and forth and through that area for a long time. I mean, the oldest remains found in that area are 1.5 million years old. So like long before us. But by the time you get to through the Paleolithic, our species exists. People are starting to settle. It's one of the earliest places people do begin to settle. So you've got Neolithic cultures developing there, farming communities, right? And the oldest of those that we have significant evidence for would be the Natufian culture. And they have sites all over the place, some of these going back, 13,500 years. So like pretty early farming communities. The peoples most closely genetically related to the Natufians are actually Yemenites today, like people of Yemen, because they later migrated south all along through the Hejaz down into Arabia, spreading the Proto-Semitic languages, so like carrying with them basic agricultural techniques, but the population stays, right? Now, some Anatolian farming communities move from the north, right? So out of where Turkey is today, right? And blend in. So now you're half and half, genetically like you're Natufian, Anatolian, right? Then a population moves in from Mesopotamia and blends in with them. And all of this is before the Bronze Age. So you've got a nice mix of peoples already there from these three locations already. That is the Canaanite civilization. That's what develops as Canaanites. And all the territories through here. So whether you're talking about the Phoenicians on the coast, or whether you're talking about Israel, Judah, Ammon, Moab, or Edom, all of them are Canaanite state areas. Right? They're all the same people originally. Right? They're just starting to separate politically and develop distinct ideals and communities. Then Bronze Age collapse, the Philistines land on the coast, right? They quickly assimilate in and blend in with Canaanite culture, but they introduce a few new bits of the mix, a few new ideas, a little bit of Aegean DNA, but they blend into it and get absorbed. So now you've got them as well. So they're on the coast and you've got these other six. So they're all there, right? Out of those, right, eventually what'll become Judaism develops. But you can start to see it as a gradual process of cultural divergence. So if you look at some early Iron Age sites in the Hill Country, in one town, you'll have in the refuse pit, there'll be pig bones. In another one, there won't be, because they've adopted dietary prohibition. They're starting to diverge culturally, right? The religious perspectives for all of them are Canaanite polytheism. So El, the oldest name for God in Hebrew, is the Canaanite sky god. And all this like El Elyon, El Shaddai, all the stuff that's still associated with the or like Elohim is in Torah a lot. Elohim is El and the Council of Gods. So El, it's kind of like Zeus and the Olympians as a phrase, right? So it's literally elements of that Canaanite polytheism that are still there, but gradually they become a bit more henotheistic. They start focusing on worship of El. Israel and Judah are pioneers in this. They're the two pursuing that most, other than out of all the Canaanite states, but they're different, and they're always different. Later, the Assyrians knock these guys out. Then, when the Assyrians are attacked, Judah absorbs Israel's territory, and that's where the conquest narrative comes in, because Joshua's conquest narrative justifies Josiah's conquest in the north. And now you have the fiction of a united monarchy and a long history here. It's still not really monotheistic, and it start heading in the direction toward monotheism until the Babylonian captivity. Right? So after the Chaldeans defeat them and they take the elites off into Mesopotamia, some of them later came back. Most of them stayed. Most of them never returned, but a small elite came back and started converting the local population, who are Canaanite polytheists, into this more monotheistic approach to it. And out of that eventually creates Judaism, which is why Judaism is named for Judah, not Yisrael, right? It's for the southern kingdom, right? That's the ultimate origin of it. And all these later states. So the Persian satrapy, the Persian province, is Judah. Then they're ruled by Greeks for a while, and then it becomes a Roman province of Judea, right? And then that ultimately gives you the diasporic connection in Judaism, right? But out of all of this, if you think about the early origins, the peoples who became Israelites and Judahites, the people of the two main hill country states, right? They are Canaanite. So are Palestinians. What ends up happening is, in the time of the ancient kingdoms, and this is one of the reasons that the ethno-state idea is so nonsensical, it was always incredibly diverse. There were polytheists of various sorts living among them. all through that period, and tons of religious diversity, tons of like arguments over what the religion is and should be. The Samaritans are actually a holdover from that, because there still are Samaritans. There's a few hundred of them, in two major communities in Israel and the West Bank today. And Samaritanism almost certainly descends from the henotheistic culture of the northern kingdom of Israel. And their Torah is still in Paleo Hebrew. It's still in the original script. The original system for Hebrew looks like Phoenician. It's a Canaanite. And theirs is still in that. So if you ever run into like the whole parable of the Good Samaritan in Christian studies, that little nice little anti-racist street is telling Jews, don't judge a Samaritan. Even Samaritans are good people. In context, Samaritans and Jews hated each other. Right. And a lot of people have forgotten that. So you lose some of the anti-racist context for that story. But they're still there. I mean, they were still rebelling against the Romans themselves in the 4th century. It's not like they ever went away. A lot of people who become Palestinians, many of them are converted Jews. Oh, you mentioned, so diaspora part. They weren't forced out. There were a bunch of people who were killed and enslaved, but no one told they all had to leave. A lot of the Jews chose to leave. They fled. They got the hell out. But many of them stayed. The only thing they were called from was Jerusalem. They were kicked out of Jerusalem. But the Palestinians will descend from Jews who stayed, from Samaritans who stayed, from other polytheists who had never managed to adopt into this, from Hellenists who were there. So tons of because in the Greek and Roman periods, there were tons of Hellenists living there. So that they'll descend from them. A lot of that population later became Christian, because when the Roman Empire officially became Christian and started pushing it, polytheism goes into decline and a lot of people become Christian. So Palestinian Christians still go back to that period. A lot of the Muslims are just Christians who converted, to Islam. But ultimately, they all descend from the Canaanite culture that existed there in the Bronze Age. It's Jews, Lebanese, and Palestinians are literally the same people, except for all the cultural layers we add on, the stories we tell ourselves, the sense of identity that we have based on our languages, our religions, our living memories. So that's the only thing that physically separates them.
Well, this common bullshit bullet point that's constantly used, I really want to put to bed, and it's nonsensical, but at the same time, it's so repeated. Like I just want to slaughter it. Is this idea that the common argument that there's no such thing as Palestinians? They're not a separate people. That they were never Palestinians. It's a new thing. You've heard that. You've heard the lines. What's your take on that?
It's a lie out of ignorance. But it's a useful lie to people, and if they count on you being ignorant as well as them, then it works. But it's really nonsensical.
What? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
Well, so I can show you where the term comes from and how that works in a second. But I think you've got another question or something to add on. So we're talking at the same time.
Yeah.
We're working out the kinks of this. We're getting in this flow of podcasting, so it's gonna be a interesting. Go ahead, Greg. What were you?
No, I was because my niche is dealing with like the militarism, of this society and their techniques and tactics and procedures on the ground. I mean, I'm interested in how this conquer narrative has been mobilized, and do you think it was? Has it? And is a lot of it from like generational trauma too, of always being persecuted, that it's so now embedded?
Yeah, in the contemporary world, for sure, there's an element of that, because it's not how we've survived for most of our existence. Right. It's not because we didn't have power. We just lived wherever we did. We found ways to survive. It's sort of like the Druzi also had to find ways to survive in hostile worlds. So you find weird compromises, different deals you can make with people. Jews have always done that. But in the narratives around the creation of the state, you do. From a military perspective, in the rhetoric, you might appreciate this at some point. It might be worth looking into here.
Joshua generation.
Yeah, the way that they're kind of like using the biblical narratives. I mean, they'll take the whole like Samson and Delilah shit and like because that was a fight against the Philistines and they'll the Philistines are Palestinians and we're going to destroy them all, and they make use of a lot of those kind of biblical narratives, and the conquest narrative of Joshua is one of them. And it's a lot.
And these were narratives.
They're from the Bible.
Well, Yeah, these were narratives like when I was watching that video, and he's bringing up the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Canaanites. These are names that I grew up with. These were in the Bible stories I learned in church and in Sunday school. So what they're doing is they're invoking that ancient time of glory when they were conquering these evil nations.
Yeah.
You know, like there and I see the crusader like tactics being used here. The same tactics used in that video is exactly what was used during the Crusader period when the Pope would issue an edict and spread it out to the peasantry of Europe and saying that we have to slaughter these heathens who are taking over the Lord's city, Jerusalem, and you're going to go there and we're going to slaughter them and gain glory of the kingdom of heaven. This is part of it. It's the same mental space that they're invoking on, and it's using these ancient stories.
Sort of. What's fascinating about it is the way that they actually twist it a bit, because if we're looking at the Joshuan narrative, then it is a priesthood leading the descendants of enslaved peoples in a ragtag band of women and children, across a desert frontier and into a foreign territory and conquering by the power of God directly. And you don't have that. There's a big difference between I'm holding an Ark of the Covenant, and therefore you must submit to me in God's power, and I'm going to stop the sun in the sky or whatever here, and then saying, you know what, I've got F-16s, bro. That's a whole different. It's like,
but it's an effective tactic. It is very effective. We have to acknowledge that it is very intelligent too, because you're playing. And that video, in my opinion, was definitely targeted for evangelical Christians. That was meant for them, because they're going to be watching this. A lot of evangelical Christians, they're going to be scrolling. They're going to find this like, oh wow, the ancient days of Israel's glory is here. Like they're going to embrace that. It brings up all these stories they hear in church. It's like, this is real. We're living it. Right. We're living that. And it's so effective though, because it worked on me once upon a time when I grew up in church.
Right. It's for Christian Zionists. It's also for the radicals in the diaspora, because the United States has been exporting our lunatics to them for a long time, and a lot of other countries have been. Like our hyper-religious nationalistic Jews, they also move there. So it's to both, but it definitely the larger numerical audience it's going for is Christian Zionists for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, I saw those guys in our own military. Like we were stationed on a joint strike force with guys from SEAL Team 6, and they were all wearing like Knights Templar crosses on their kits. I was like, awesome, man. Are you here to run a bank? But it's so pervasive. And that's what so many people are realizing since October, is how entrenched this is within our own society as well.
Oh, gosh.
And like,
I'm sure I can't find it, but so there's a lot of like weird Zionist comics that get made sometimes, and I swear there's one that was just like, holy shit, that I had to save. Like the cover of it is a crusader knight in armor and like the flowing white little tabard over the front of it, and the horse and the barding on the horse and all this shit. But it's like the blue Magen David on it, and it's like like a Zionist crusader. And I'm like, holy shit, the very first victims of the Crusades were Jews in the Rhine Valley. Like, and when they got to the Holy Land, they massacred the Jews that lived there in Jerusalem. Like, what the fuck? Like, they adopt the same imagery, which I thought was just, oh man, it was cringy for me as a historian.
But because it was the People's Crusade, and then when they sacked Jerusalem, everyone got the sword. But of course, I'm always mystified by this selective interpretation of history mobilized for a political gain, especially when it's used to justify what is clearly a genocide incitement speech and the actual practical effectuation of a genocide.
And like from a Christian perspective, for example, like I'm Christian. I consider myself to be very, very religious, and I believe the Bible. I am a literalist when it comes to the Bible. And so when I see this type of language using the stories that I personally believe are true, I respect your opinion on it as well. Like I love the fact that you're telling your perspective on that history, but I'm just speaking for like, the people that, like Muslims and Christians who believe in these stories as literal. Even in that context, though, even in the literal context of me believing the Bible in this literal form, is like you're using a story about the conquering of the Canaanites by Israel, and you're applying it as if which I believe happened, but you're applying it in the modern day against Palestinians who are so like they're for one thing, they're Muslim, meaning the majority of Palestinians are Muslim, obviously. So that means that they believe in the same stories, and they're connecting with the same God of Abraham that told the Israelites to do that. And I'm like, the irony there, I cannot fathom, because it's like, it's not like Muslims are some group that's separated from the tradition of Abraham. Like, they're in the same tradition as you. They're reading the Torah. They're reading the Tanakh. Like, they're reading. They believe in the same stories. They respect the same prophets. They respect Moses. They respect Joshua. They respect Elijah. They revere all those guys. They're reading these same things, and they're identifying to it. So it's like, that's what's ironic to me about it. Is like you're trying to create this. You're trying to take this group and putting them in this box of an ancient heathens. That's the ironic part to me.
I mean, but that's been happening for
as well as the fact that
like even if you like read Dante's Inferno, like they describe Muhammad's tortures eternally in pornographic detail. This is nothing new.
Yeah,
it's just being mobilized in a way that a lot of people haven't seen before.
Right, and the one of the funny historical ironies from a theological perspective, right? Muhammad was pitching himself as a prophet within the Hebrew tradition, and Jews were considered part of the community of the faithful to begin with, right? It was a political split that later separated them, and the faith Arabized a little bit, but it still retains all of those elements where he was literally putting himself within that Hebrew prophetic tradition. So all those stories are important to them too. When the Israelis have foiled several plots to destroy the Dome of the Rock so a temple can be built there, but the Dome of the Rock, which is, just as a historical thing, the finest surviving example of Umayyad era architecture, but still, that exists not as a mosque, but as a shrine to Abraham. Because the rock at the pinnacle of that hill is, by tradition, where they think that Abraham almost sacrificed his son. So it's literally honoring, that story, and everyone's connection to it. And yet, it means nothing to it. The fun thing about this is, from a Muslim perspective, Jews and Christians cannot be infidels. They're literally Ahl al-Kitab, peoples of the book. They have a revealed religion. Muslims think that Christians wrote a few things down wrong at some point and messed their ideas up, so they had to send more prophets to correct stuff. But in essence, it's important. Isa, Jesus, is one of the most significant, probably is easily the second most significant prophet in Islam. Is Jesus. Like, they accept those stories as well as the Jewish ones. Both of those people are believers to Muslims, but to Christians, Jews have been cast out, and Muslims are heretics who worship the wrong God and worship the wrong, they think they worship Muhammad or whatever instead of Jesus. And Jews,
they think that Allah is a separate God. Jesus called him Allah in Aramaic. Like, it's so similar to the way he said it. So that's insane to me.
Allah is just Arabic for the God. So, I mean, Christian.
It's an evolution of El, like El, Allah, Allah, Allah.
Yeah,
Allah. It's just an accent. It's an accent.
Well, it's because the Semitic languages are all related, ultimately, right? So there's an etymological relationship between, like, the Canaanite sky god or high god and the Hijazi sky god or high god. They do have different histories, but they build on the same basic platform, that very earliest oral elements. But
but in American churches, they say that Allah, they're constantly shoved down our throats that Allah is a separate God.
Which,
it's like,
again,
no, it's the God of Abraham. It's just another pronunciation of it.
They all do. Like,
exactly.
And that Allah Akbar is like a Christian statement as well. Like, Christians
exactly.
I will say, because I didn't grow up as a Christian Zionist, I went to Protestants. I was Presbyterian. That's how I grew up, at least. I've never heard that, like, separation personally, but I guess we're kind of more liberal church. But it seems like they've created this separate reality based off of revisionist, misunderstood, politically mobilized use of history, and a lot of it's secular. So when we look at Israel, and most citizens don't go to the synagogue, but there is a far belligerent, almost fascist right, we could say. Do you think
literally?
Okay, literally. Okay, do you think they've kind of, like, taken over? Would a corollary be like they've taken over the political life of Israel, like a loud, belligerent minority, the same way that you could say that something like MAGA took over Republican politics.
Yes, sort of. It's more a matter of how fractious Israel's electoral system is. It is it's a parliamentary democracy, which we don't have. We're one of the least democratic democracies. So governments are always coalitions of multiple parties, and it's an unusually fractious one where parties will rise and fall constantly. Someone will create a whole new party, run for 2 years, disband the party, and start all over again. So there's constant turnover, and it's very difficult to form a coalition because Israel's electoral laws have a very low bar for representation in the Knesset. So small parties get in. And if you only have, 120 seats and somebody gets in with 2, that 2 actually matters out of 120 if you're trying to build a coalition. So even the most fringy ideas have a place. And what ends up happening is that you'll have a ruling party, so Netanyahu's party, like a ruling party can get in power with 20% of the vote. It's not like where MAGA is actually a majority of the Republican Party, who are a minority of the electorate overall, because 45% of Americans are independents, many people don't vote, whatever, like things like that. But of the actual Republican movement, they're like the beating heart of that, and have seized total control of the movement, because we only have 2 right-wing parties in this country and no real other options. But you have a whole shitload of separate right-wing parties in Israel that all form coalitions. So any individual party might have 2 or 3 seats in the Knesset, but they still matter. So that it blends in. What's taken over is more the ideological drift, the moving farther and farther right. The elements of the secular right in Israel literally have their origins in the early 20th century as a fascist movement in the 20s and 30s. It's like classic era originally. It always had that hard ethno-nationalist component to it. And you can see that in a lot of their work all the way through in the pre-state period. I mean, the Irgun, which was literally a terrorist group, was connected the revisionist Zionist movement to that fascistic hard right. And the Likud and the Herut, the previous party, they both descend directly from Jabotinsky's revisionist movement. So that fascist element, that ethno-national element, is in its DNA. But what makes it in some ways more powerful is 2 basic trends. One is the structural factors in the conflict itself, right? Playing on that generational trauma. So they do something shitty to somebody, they occasionally pew back or whatever, using a little TikTok language. We joked about that earlier. Somebody shoots back at you, and then that triggers the generational trauma. So you fight back harder, and you can appeal to more people based on fear. It creates a feedback loop that makes the country more and more right wing, because you can play on fear. Oh, Hamas attacked us, and therefore that justifies the next bigger attack, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger year after year after year. But also, we shouldn't completely leave out the fact that even significant elements of the Zionist left from the start were pretty hardcore ethno-nationalists. Ben Gurion was a territorial maximalist who wanted 100% of Palestine. And we tend to lie about that now and say, oh no, they were going to compromise and take only part of it. And there's a reference to like the Palestinians being offered a state at the beginning. They were literally not present at the table. They were never offered a state. But even there, the idea of them taking a portion of it is literally false if you look at Ben Gurion's journals and letters. And if you look at his speeches before it, where he's saying, like, we're going to take 90 to 100% of this thing totally. We'll take whatever we can. We'll start with whatever we can get, and we'll conquer the rest. So it's that conquest narrative affects the labor faction as well. There are other Zionist factions. I always love putting to people like, Martin Buber and the communists. And there's a whole bunch of Zionists who wanted to buy national state, who didn't want outright conquest. They got outvoted. They faded into a minority. They still exist. There's a significant portion of the secular Israeli population that has never liked this shit. But they're a minority voice, because the dominant labor faction and the fasci right always agreed on the kind of Joshua narrative. Let's take all of it. So it's in a sense part of the DNA of the state.
Listening to so many of like these Zionist arguments over the past 4 months, I've just noticed one thing. They've never ever mentioned once that the Palestinians lost out on this deal. There's no acknowledgement there, which is kind of astounding to me. There's no like, they were offered a deal, but like, yeah, we're also occupying lands. I just wonder, like, how do you think they reconcile that, like, that dissonance?
Because of the lies about offers of deals. They can keep telling themselves that Palestinians have been offered a state, and there's just endless videos you can find. They were offered a state 6 different times and turned it down every time. So they never lose an opportunity to lose an opportunity, and they just hate us irrationally, and they're just like the European anti-Semites. And every single part of it is literally false, because they have never been offered a sovereign state, nor have they been offered binational equality. Neither of those have happened. What they have are like weird partial truths that you can twist rhetorically to mean something and count on someone's ignorance, especially the foreign media, because we talk about all the peace process and all that shit here in a way that makes it look like, oh yeah, Arafat was offered a state and he turned it down. No, he wasn't. It's literally false. But it's the story our media ran with, because it's the story the Israeli government told us. And we don't care to look into it, media-wise. So Americans don't know about it, so that Zionist propaganda works.
That was this was all one of my questions. The bullet points that we wrote down that was one of the next one, the lines of bullshit, that they've been offered a state solution and they kept turning it down. And I'm glad you dissected that. Can you dissect the other instances?
Yeah.
Can you dissect the other instances where they were offered a state solution and that they turned it down?
Yeah, sure.
And break it down.
Yeah, I'll talk about a handful of the most important ones that show up in those discussions, the places where it seems like it might be closer, and we'll show why it's nonsense. Because I don't know how anybody ever talks about things like the roadmap or Annapolis or something as actually being an offer, because they're just like, hey, we agree to keep talking, is all they ever said. So they don't even belong on the list. But there's 4 times that actually you can see why they're trying to twist it that way. But I do want to first, if you don't mind, you asked something about the origins of Palestinians and their name earlier on, and how it's all been modern.
Well, I realize that it's a really complex issue, but this common fallacy of saying that they're not a people as a justification to dehumanize them, like, they think they're special. They're not a special people. Yeah. I'm tired of hearing it, but then again, I lack the historical knowledge that you do to really outline why they are a unique people, but you can do a better job breaking that down.
Yeah, one of the reasons it's so offensive to me that it can be swallowed uncritically is that we complain when people like Putin say that Ukrainians aren't a real people and that their land is all Russia, and we're like, how dare you do that, because they are a different people. And like, okay, so why is it okay for them, and why do we do that there? I mean, right. Ukraine doesn't become formally an independent country until 1991. It's tried a few other times in the past. I mean, it tried during World War II. It tried during World War I. I mean, there's time, but it's not a country until 1991. But we have no problem at all saying that Ukrainians are a distinct people that have always been different. And we completely
same with the Pakistanis. Same with the Pakistanis. Same thing. When did they become a nation?
Relatively recent country, exactly. I mean, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh honestly don't even make a bloody bit of sense. I mean, the Punjab is divided between 2 countries. Bengal is divided between 2 countries. What the fuck is this? But we just like, oh yeah, that's totally fine. Yeah, makes sense. But we completely ignore that, and we just say, oh, Arabs are all Arabs, which is about as racist as it gets, because the people who speak Arabic are exactly like the people who speak the Romance languages. And I think one of the flaws in our popular discourse is that we refer to Arabic as a single language. And partly that's because in the modern period, they invented a modern standard for media to connect the news media across different countries, and made up a fake modern language based on the classical one. But it's not what anybody speaks. No one speaks that on the streets. The Moroccan Arabic and Egyptian Arabic and Iraqi Arabic and Yemeni Arabic, they're not mutually intelligible. It's like Portuguese and Italians talking to each other. If you speak really slowly and you write shit down and you repeat your words a few times, I'll get the gist of it, It's just like, right. I can make sense of, I had no problem making sense of Yiddish because I had German and Hebrew, but I don't speak the language. I can puzzle it out. I can like, oh shit, that sounds a bit like this word in German. Okay, cool. I can get that. That's how Arabs would talk to each other. They don't actually speak the same language. It's literally like the Romance language family. So the argument that all Arabs are the same is like, well, why don't we just say like Portugal can't exist anymore? Portugal belongs to Rome. France belongs to Rome. Give it all back to Italy. That's the kind of nonsensical line they're making. The peoples in Yemen, Egypt, Morocco, Iraq, they're descendants of the people who already lived there. And that's true for Palestinians too. The Palestinians are not Arabs in a sense of Arabian DNA. The Arab conquest in the Rashidun and Umayyad caliphates, almost no Arabs ever settled in and intermarried. They just didn't. They stayed in garrison towns. They didn't try to convert people. They didn't intermarry. They just conquered them the way the Romans did. They did less direct efforts to assimilate than the Romans did, not more. Over time, people adopted Arabic and a form of it, just like people adopted Vulgar Latin in the Roman world, because it was useful, especially as people start converting to Islam. It's useful. But then it takes on all these characters and colorings from your own world. So the forms spoken in Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, they have a significant Amazigh substrate, Berber substrate to them. The form in Egypt, it has a significant Coptic element, which is where the musical quality comes from. Palestinian, it has Aramaic elements. There's the Lebanese, Syrian, and Palestinian Arabic has significant elements of the Aramaic that was spoken there before the Arab conquest. So it's a distinct language. The peoples themselves, what could be Palestinian, right? So first off, Philistia, is from the sea peoples, right? What the Egyptians called the Peliset. But if you use their own language, it's Palestine. The Greek translation is Philistia. The Latin translation is Palestina, but Palestine is their name, So there's a Palestine before Abraham fucking gets there, if you take your Bible literally. Now, again, I can't as a scholar, but for you who do, you would have to put the Palestinians there first, which is, interesting, right? Now, set that aside, because they, of course, blend into the Canaanite culture, and they're there. The name, the use of that name, it's old as dirt. Not only does it go back to the end of the Bronze Age with the Palestine population, the Philistines, right? Not only is that name in use for the southern portion of the Holy Land from the end of the Bronze Age on, by the time you get a few centuries later, and the Greeks are talking about it, they divide the Levant into a northern part and a southern part, and they refer to the southern part as Philistia. So the entire area where today Israel, Palestine, and Western Jordan are was Philistia to the Greeks, and that's still surviving in tons of records. Everyone knew about it. When the Romans were there, they called it Palestina. So when the Arabs took it over, they took it in as Palestine because there's no P there, and they retained it as a local knowledge, and it was used constantly. You've got letters from the 17th, 18th century talking about it and saying, I live in Palestine. Now, was it a country? No, but neither was Germany.
But neither was Pakistan. Neither was
Germany,
Ukraine.
Fucking Portugal. They weren't countries. At some point, they invented them, Yeah. So,
it's
a
ridiculous argument.
Understood that they lived in Palestine. Like that. That memory goes back literally now thousands of years, because it goes back into the Greek and Philistine period, that there's a knowledge that that's the region. Hell, if you're looking at the Strip itself, like where the current attacks are taking, Gaza City in the north, that word is Philistine. Gaza is not an Arabic word. Like the name of the city, that city has had that name since the fucking Philistines. For instance, like two other cities like just north of it in Israel, Ashdod and Ashkelon, they're also Philistine names. They're not Hebrew names.
Yeah. They're in the Bible. You see Ashdod listed in the Bible.
But Gaza is in the Bible as well. So it never changed. Like, if you're not going to bother changing the names of the cities, you clearly have a cultural memory of the peoples and the languages spoken before, right? Otherwise, why wouldn't they have changed the name at some point? If it was a bunch of, like, I don't know, Arab migrants or something, like, okay, so I'm living in Southern California, right? We've got, Los Angeles and San Diego and San Francisco and like all this shit, because we remember, the Spanish were here first. And we acknowledge that. And it's a part of our history. The Palestinians have always acknowledged their history. So to say that they have no national identity is literally dehumanizing Nazi-style rhetoric, because it argues that they're just not human, because all peoples everywhere in the world have a sense of their local identity. Whether it has a political state attached to it is a whole different issue. Is anyone going to go around and say that Kurds don't exist or the Balochis don't exist? Right? They don't have countries.
There are certain elements in Pakistan that might want to say
assholes,
that.
yeah, for sure. But obviously, like they have a language, you know. I mean, they have an identity. They just don't have state institutions. Palestinians have always had a local sense of self, and there's tons of scholarship on it. You know, in its earlier forms, medieval, 18th, 19th centuries, long before Zionism, they knew that they lived in Palestine.
And you can see it in such a visceral way, too, like beyond the historical context. You look at the emotional context of that, about their connection with the land. You've seen these videos. I'm sure you've seen them. They're heartbreaking. They're one of the most heartbreaking videos I've seen, where they will be chopping down an olive grove with the chainsaw, and they'll be crying. The Palestinian who has been tended that land, he literally inherited that land from generations in the past. He's holding onto the ground and he's crying. Now, my family owns a farm up in Iowa, right? It's been in the family for 150 years. Just 150 years though. And I've come from colonists. So if that ever happened to my family, I'd be devastated too. I could not imagine that happening to somebody who it's been passed down for possibly 1,000 years in the family, and they have these traces. So you not only do you have the historical context that you're pointing out, and the anthropological context in the academic sense, but you have the emotional connection that you see in HD quality happening before our eyes. And but it's been framed as this competitiveness of this indigenous competitiveness.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Like, who got there first? And trying to completely discredit the Palestinian side of things in its entirety. So I think, like, what I'm curious about, it's like we talked about how this is so entrenched within Israeli political and social life, these ideas that we continue to see espoused by politicians, by average citizens, by settlers, by soldiers. How does something like this ideology, this worldview, this secular worldview, get dismantled ever?
Yeah, that's that's the rub. What do you do about
that? That is the rub. Yeah.
Because once an identity has taken root, it's very difficult to unpack. This is why, again, it's hard to delegitimize Palestinians, because they know who they are. They have long family history. I mean, you talk about your 150-year-old family farm. An olive tree 150 years old produces shitty olives. I mean, olive trees take a long time to mature, a long time to make really good oil. So, yeah, they're important, because when somebody plants a new olive tree, they're making an investment for their great-great-grandchildren, and they know it.
Yeah.
So there's a deep sense of, there's a deep emotional connection. There's a reason Israelis consciously dig up olive trees and move them to settlements, or cut them down or whatever, or like build walls to cut people off from it, because they know there's an emotional connection there. Because it's a part of identity, and people use different elements, different stories, different things in the world to fashion that sense of self, to give you a sense of self, right? Once those myths exist, they're very hard to unpack, which is why so many peoples around the world have myths that are hundreds and thousands of years old that, again, they may not even be remotely true. That, honestly, again, from my scholarly perspective, is true for a lot of the biblical narrative. There are tons of elements that are historical, and tons of elements that somebody just made up at some point, but they become such a part of your sense of self that it's very hard to view them as anything other than a personal attack if somebody says it didn't happen. So it's how do you do it once that's unleashed? It's hard. Because when in constructing the Zionist political identity in the mid-19th century, right? So you're starting with Hess and Pinsker and the Chovevit Zion movement, and finally getting to Herzl and everything else. It takes a long time to build up, right? But as you're building this movement up, they were consciously choosing and using allusions to the broader Jewish history and its narratives and its traumas. Because if you can tie a political project to those emotional traumas and that history and to Tanakh, then how the fuck do you get rid of it? And there's just using Zionism as a word is problematic. And this is one of the things I have to talk to people a lot about in Palestinian spaces, because they'll be like, oh, Zionism is evil, Zionism is bad, we got to get rid of it. No, like Zionism is actually a fundamental part of Judaism, but in a different form than it's used now.
Mm-hmm.
They adopt the terminology to connect, to ride on that, you know?
I want to say a point about that before you get into the origin of Zionism. Here's something that's been my take. Like Zion, the concept of Zion is a very holy concept, and it's a beautiful concept in the Bible for when you take it in its context. The concept of Zion was a celebration of the Temple Mount, where all nations can come together and worship in equality. They're all equal, meaning there's no tier system. It's so that the concept of Zion is such a beautiful concept, and it angers me that it has been appropriated to mean something the complete opposite of what the concept is in the Bible. But it sounds
sort of. The biblical part about it is actually has a supremacist narrative encoded in it. And
you think so?
Well, think of it this way: they had to centralize worship at Jerusalem in one place, because it wasn't how it was worshipped before. And that you have stories in the Bible of, so Josiah goes up and smashes the altars of Beth Shean, I mean, he's literally saying, you can't worship God here anymore. You got to worship him my way at my place. That's not, that's beautiful in a sense that we can all share it, but it's also like we can share it because you have to do it my fucking way or the highway, bro. That's what they were saying. That's like the whole, Jewish Samaritan split and all this other stuff. There's elements of that in there. And when people are taking it out, they're not so much completely making it up as focusing on the worst aspects of it, on the most barbaric elements of the Bible in order to fashion a nationalist movement.
Yeah, and we see that. Yeah, and we see a lot of that like kind of seep into how they just do politics and how they've operated politically since the inception. It's that same my way or the highway. There's no compromise. There's no backing down. There's no. We look at like the geopolitical decisions Israel's making right now, and it seems insane to me.
No one wants to talk about Syria offering a peace deal in 1949. Because they literally said, "Hey, we'll settle 200,000 Palestinians, make a permanent peace deal right now. All you got to do is share the waters of Lake Kinneret with us." And Ben Gurion said, "Nah, fuck off. We're keeping the lake." So that refusal is so like.
Yeah, and I just wonder, like looking at this, like refusals from the start, but are they able to be self-aware enough to understand that they're being like passing an event horizon where they're going to be sucked into a black hole of like straight up pariah statehood? Is there any like political awareness around that?
It is known. It's discussed constantly in the Israeli press. There are elements of the right that just don't care. They're perfectly comfortable with that. And from their perspective, it fits into the longer history of Jewish generational trauma. Like, well, we've been pariahs before. We've been treated like shit before. We'll survive. It's fine. We can do it. We're strong. So for the right, they don't care. A lot of other people do. There are polls that I point to people in classes showing that up to 80% of Israelis between their 20s, 30s, 40s, would leave the country if they got a good job offer. Like they just people are just like, this is fucked up, man. This is not a normal country. This is not how we wanted it to be. So it's not.
That was my impression. That was my impression living there.
Yeah, but we are exposed to these statistics that seem to be founded on solid parameters, saying that the younger generations are actually the more fascist. That the most liberal, or what we would call progressive, are like what we'd associate with boomers and Gen X, and like as we get down to younger and younger,
in some of the political
it becomes
class.
more militant.
And if you're looking at the settlers and some of the political class, that's true. If you're looking at the majority of the population, it's really not. But a lot of the people in Israel feel disenfranchised. They don't vote. They tune out. The left has been depressed for decades now. They just don't bother. Like, what's the point? Because every time they participate, every time they get involved, every time they work hard in an election, it just gets worse and worse anyway. So, we're exposed to a particular aspect of the Israeli population, and we ignore just how many of them are, A, sincerely committed to real change and to justice for Palestinians, or B, they're just frustrated and don't give a shit at all anymore. You know, there's a,
well, we
there's a
don't we
real
don't we
nihilist
don't see
intent there.
those we don't see or hear those voices ever. Like
Right,
I
because they're
don't
not
know,
useful
just
for
for
people here.
yeah, and also is there like a leftist like news publication that comes out of Israel that people could like actually see and reference in the real
Haaretz has
world?
been the only one, really, right? Haaretz has been the only
It's just
one,
like center
mostly
left. I mean,
center left. Yeah,
there are definitely a lot more critical ones. I mean, hell, there's literally like anarchist and communist movements active in Israel. I mean, you got
Mhm.
anarchists against the wall organizing all the time. You got groups like Solidarity and Solidarity Sheikh Jarrah, going after settlers. You know, you've got tons of groups like Bet Selem out there documenting atrocities and talking about the architecture of apartheid. You know, you've got the Committee Against Home Demolitions. There's just tons and tons of sources people could look at that describe this stuff in astonishingly blunt detail with language that American newspapers will never use. Israelis have been calling Israel an apartheid state for decades. And
Yeah, we never hear
the
that.
New York Times will never use the term.
Mhm.
well, this leads into one of the bullet points I was going to save for later, but now that we're talking about it, fuck it, let's do it.
Well,
I have
just because
sorry, go
we
ahead.
still had it was Greg had asked about the peace deal the offers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, like there. So do you want me to do that first or?
Oh yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
we can
yeah,
jump
we
to wherever
could,
you want.
yeah, we could reference that for sure.
I just want to make sure we don't
Yeah.
we don't lose it. You know, because
No, go for it. Yeah,
Uh,
it's all chaos here, anyways. Go for it.
uh,
Fuck it.
so
100%.
one
Yeah,
thing
yeah,
I'll point
we're
to.
treading water right now.
I don't even know where I am. Where the fuck am I right now? You're in a library. He's in a kitchen.
Am I lost at some campus somewhere? What is this? The first one people will often point to is the British Peel proposal stuff. You know, like the Peel Commission looking at how to possibly subdivide the land, and they go through multiple revisions of maps. They're thinking about it, and they put out some feelers and try to talk to people about it. But there's no one really to ask because it's taking place during the context of the 36 Arab Revolt, and they have killed or driven into exile anybody with any possible claim to leadership among Palestinians. And they had refused over the previous decade to allow actual representative institutions among Palestinians to develop. The Jews were left alone, you know, the Zionist movement to create like their own. The Yishuv basically, it taxed itself, regulated itself, organized itself. Like they had a lot of autonomy. The Palestinians were treated as colonial subjects. So there was no one really to ask. But they did ask the WZO about this, like, what would you do? And there's like, yeah, totally. We'll take whatever you offer us, however small it is, we'll take it. And then we have the documentation between Chaim Weizmann and Ben Gurion saying, yeah, we'll just take the rest anyway. It doesn't matter. But no one actually offered the Palestinians anything because that deal was never offered. The Brits looked at it. They considered several plans for it. They looked at maps and they said, you know what? This is impossible. This would involve so much violent ethnic cleansing and just, you know, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't be economically viable anyway. So why do it? Like ecologically, you can't really do it. So they abandoned it and never offered it to anybody. So that's not an offer because no one was offered anything there. You know, it's just false. The next one they point to is the UN. So you get like UNSCOP in 1947 looking at this and the whole like division there. The key thing there about that division is that Palestinians asked to slow the process down so they could organize their own delegation and be present in the negotiations. And that was declined. They weren't at the table. Mm-hmm. They weren't asked about this. The division between Arab and Jewish parts was to create, you know, a Jewish state and then turn that other land over to other existing Arab states. Palestinians were never consulted and never offered anything at all. So Palestinians weren't offered anything. When people point to that, they're falling back into that same old Arab racism where you're saying, well, Arabs are Arabs. It doesn't matter. You know, if they're Syrian, Egyptian, who they care? You know, what the hell's the difference between an Egyptian and a Palestinian anyway? Well, I don't know. Right. Language, culture, history, everything. But there's no offer there. You get forward to so the whole actual negotiations with Palestinians, right? So the Madrid and Oslo processes, you know, they'll be talking about things like that. So Madrid was interesting because the U.S. was actually there, and we actually had a president who was willing to threaten the Israelis to get them to the table. But then the Israelis cheated, opened their own line of direct negotiations with the Palestinians at Oslo and cut us out so they could take a dominant position and basically talk over the Palestinians because they had all the cards. And what they were offering there was autonomy. The end goal here, and this is something you can see from the very beginning, in 1967, when the West Bank was conquered, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol said, "This is sovereign Israeli territory. We're never leaving." And every single government since then has maintained that position, including Yitzhak Rabin, where everyone's always saying, "Oh yeah, he wanted a two-state solution. He was going to give the Palestinians a state." No, he wasn't. He was literally one of the architects of ethnic cleansing in the first place. And during the Intifada, he was just like, shoot them, torture them, teach them a lesson. They need the iron boot on their neck, kind of thing. Just no mercy. This is not the angel that was going to offer them true autonomy. What they wanted was something akin to the Bantustan model of South Africa, where you have encircled areas with some autonomy, and we'll just pretend you're independent, but you're actually completely controlled and surrounded, no control of your airspace, borders, everything else. They're like isolated internal colonies that they can ignore and then not have to take care of or provide resources for. That was the proposal. That's the model that they were pursuing. Never a sovereign state. In the Oslo process, the PLO recognized Israel as a state, and the Israelis acknowledged that Palestinians exist as human beings and that the PLO can talk for them. There was no promise of anything made at any point in that process, other than something akin to Bantustans. The most significant of them that people can point to is the Camp David discussions in 99 and 2000. And the bit there is they'll come back to, Barak offered a state and Arafat said no, and everyone blamed Arafat for that. And yeah, he did come out publicly say, this is bullshit. This is not a deal. This is not an offer. What are you talking about? Because they never actually made an offer. Like, it literally didn't happen. And they know it, and they said it at the time, but our media doesn't report it that way. And obviously, your TikTok-y type sources aren't going to report it that way. What they did was, going into those negotiations, the goal for Barak was still a non-sovereign entity that would be demilitarized and have no control over its borders. So it would have still been a virtual colony, not truly independent, right? But he was told before the negotiations started that he could never get it through, that his own government wouldn't pass it. So he was told he can't offer a damn thing. So he didn't. Mm-hmm. What they did was they continued the negotiations anyway. They carried out the charade so that they could blame Arafat for the fallout from it. Instead of
we're starting to see the same thing too right now, because the White House is doing a soft float of eventually talking about a two-state solution. Well, that two-state solution that they're talking about, it's basically just to make the liberals and on the East Coast feel like okay going to spin class again after this. But in my opinion, it's demilitarized. A demilitarized state is a non-viable state because you need a military, for self-defense, because Palestine has a right to defend itself. Also, just for a host of diplomatic purposes. And also, who is going to defend the demilitarized Palestinian state? The Gulf states? A coalition Israel. Of Gulf states?
That's the thing.
What fresh hell is that? So, also, the West Bank...
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, also the West Bank and Gaza are not contiguous. They're not connected at all. So that's an administrative nightmare. You see what happened to Pakistan and Bangladesh when they were separated by, it's just patent. It's weird because now I'm just starting to realize that it's just the same old MO that they've been using.
Yeah, sort of. Now, to add a little nuance into there, technically speaking, a demilitarized state isn't a big deal. There are a number of them in the world. As long as you have other deals with other people and no real threats. Iceland doesn't need a military. You're totally fine. You're part of NATO. You've got friends around you. No big deal at all. They literally don't need it.
Because that's what happened with demilitarized Germany post World War II and demilitarized Imperial Japan. Because
Germany we didn't allow. We didn't allow them to be demilitarized. The Soviets wanted it to be demilitarized. That's why we created West Germany, because they insisted it be demilitarized and neutral, and we said, no, we want German industry on our side. So the split in Germany is technically, Truman's fault. But separate issue there. But Iceland is like demilitarized in a sense. It doesn't need to defend itself because it has friends. It made deals. So something like that could technically happen. In this case, the real problem with it is not the demilitarization. It's that they would have no ability to have friends because the Israelis will still assert sovereignty. They control the borders, they control the territory, so Arab states could not protect it. They couldn't have those alliances because from the international diplomatic perspective, it would still be Israeli responsibility. It's a colony, not a country. That's the underlying problem, not that they're disarmed and they cannot make alliances. That's the key. The other part with like discontiguous stuff, the West Bank itself is a bunch of isolated cantonments because you're not getting all those settlers out of there. You know, there's what 700,000 people at this point almost. You know, you're not moving all those people out of there in those cities. So that's discontiguous. But that in itself, like look at a map sometime between Oman and the Emirates. They both have exclaves in the other country. You know, like I mean, at one point there's like here's the country and here's an exclave and here's another exclave inside that exclave. Right, you know, you're kind of like you're surrounded doubly. You know, it makes no fucking sense. But the countries get along well, so who cares? Like it's as long as those deals exist, that would be fine. But that cannot be the case here because again, the desire for a kind of neo-colonial relationship. So it ultimately always falls down to Israel asserting permanent sovereignty over the entirety of historic Palestine and only tolerating a certain level of autonomy for Palestinians because they don't want to integrate them and make them citizens. That's the key to the issue here. And that's the problem that affects all negotiations and why the two-state thing has always been a two-state delusion. It can't happen because the Israelis ideologically and politically cannot tolerate it. You know, it couldn't work. You know, so it's just it's a waste of time because you're ultimately asking people, please submit to permanent colonial status, and when you get that and you're okay with it, then we'll have peace. But that's
and then you're just gonna have to trust us. You're just gonna have to trust us that we're not gonna abuse you. We're not gonna come into your towns. We're not gonna kidnap your children. We're not gonna shoot little kids. We're not gonna put in prison 100 of you at a time. You're just gonna have to trust us on that and trust us.
And hey, we've
don't have
got
history of that at all.
Freedom is just
got a 75-year track record of really engendering trust. But
Oh no, that's in the past. That's in the past. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about that.
But so there's a lack of trust. But again, to be fair, there's a lack of trust on both sides of this because of the way that the modern Zionist movement hitches a ride on legitimate Jewish generational trauma. You know, the way that any type of resistance here in their framing, the way that they would understand it, plays into this larger context. It's hard to see your own actions or crimes, and this is a problem that goes way beyond that. Not only do other settler colonial states like the U.S., Canada, Australia have a bad record in this kind of area where you actually can't respect the narrative of the peoples that were colonized, but you also have tons of issues like that with minority cultures all over Europe, all over the world, where you don't actually acknowledge other peoples there because your own narrative kind of supersedes it. It's unthinkable. You can't wrap your head around how you could possibly have ever caused any of these problems. So whenever they shoot you back, it's them attacking irrationally and completely unprovoked. So like everyone's talking about how the 7th October thing was completely unprovoked. There was peace, and then Hamas broke that peace. I'm like, what the fuck kind of peace is there when 200 people are shot every year? You know, when there are thousands of people on administrative detention, like being held without charges, you know, like when there are people literally living under apartheid laws. That's not peace. That is enforced submission. And that's the status quo everyone wants. And our Western narrative and what complicates things here for our politics, for our media, for our universities and everything else, everyone wants to take that ideal of enforced submission and say that is a desirable peace, and that's what Palestinians have to accept. And it's just not going to happen.
And we also wield the U.S. definition of terrorist like a cudgel. Like that.
Yes.
That is intentionally designed, and that's what I realized when I was doing intelligence analysis in the military. I was like, okay, how are these guys terrorists?
You were Army, right?
Yeah, I was Army. I started off as
Yeah, so the U.S. Army's definition of terrorism is the use or threat of violence to achieve a political objective. It's literally in their manuals. That's how they define it.
Yeah.
For fuck's sake, that's war. I mean,
That's
Yeah.
every violent
if you
action
are-
committed by every country
you
ever.
park an aircraft carrier off the coast of something, that's fucking terrorism in that definition. And that's when terrorism was first coined as a word and was used back in the 18th and 19th century. That's what they meant. It was threatening violence to achieve a political purpose. What we tend to do is we separate what state actors do
And non-state
from
actors.
non-state actors, and then we tend also to separate the population. So non-state actors inside Israel, because there are Jewish nationalists who hate the Israeli government, right? There are settlers who actually shoot at the IDF. I mean, there are some radicals that live in the West Bank. Those populations, when they lash out at Palestinians, when they torch churches and mosques, when they stone people, we never talk about that as terrorism. I once did a media study on one of the most blatant and offensive acts that I could think of, right? So I looked at the 1994 Baruch Goldstein killing in the Ibrahimi Mosque, aka the Cave of the Machpelah, so the Cave of the Patriarchs. This dude got his Galil assault rifle and some magazines, walked past the security guards and straight in while Muslims were at prayer and opened fire on them. So you're just like, here's 100 dead people, massive atrocity here. The U.S. press never called it terrorism. I'm like digging through LexisNexis. I'm looking through every possible paper I can find. You get all the old tropes. Lone wolf, extremist, radical. No one
Fanatic,
terrorist. But yet we
mental
call
health issues.
But the Houthis are terrorists because they hijacked some ships and killed 0 people. Like
and filmed a music video dancing with the crew.
Yeah,
if that's terrorism, I like that version. I mean, if that's the new form of warfare where you can just hijack a ship and have a music video on the top deck.
What you're threatening is capital flows and empire. Any threat to us must be terrorism, and any threat to an unworthy victim can't be terrorism. That's the kind of like cognitive dissonance we're dealing with here, and that's why it's so difficult to talk about this stuff to Americans, because quite honestly, our ignorance is honest. If our media never calls Christian or Jewish radicals terrorists, then we only think that Muslims must be the bad people. But the most violent, in terms of body count, the most violent terrorist group in world history is actually a Christian one. No offense to you, sir, but you
can rip on Christianity anytime you want.
100,000 bodies to its credit. That beats the fuck out of anybody else.
Yeah.
And we don't think of them that way. We don't use those words. So yeah, you're right, Greg. Terrorism has been weaponized as a term for particular people.
Right, and also that's not the only term that's manipulated, used specifically to manipulate Americans. Also, if you go into military doctrine and go through the field manuals and stuff, there is a complete leveraging of language to kind of frame it in such a way that Americans will accept. It's we're not defending empire in the Gulf of Aden. We are ensuring freedom of navigation around the globe. I was oh, freedom. That's good. We defend freedom. Yeah.
What's the name of the operation in the red? What's the name of that operation in that strait? What do they call it? Operation
Prosperity Guardian.
Prosperity Guardian. What a beautiful angelic name. Prosperity Guardian. I love it. It's so it gives you that warm fuzzy feeling you're just gonna
trickle down economics. Everyone's getting rich.
And we have been a mercenary force for global capital for over a century. This is not new. But you still the indoctrination you're talking about in the military here is the same kind of shit you're getting for Israelis too. It's honestly a lot of their ignorance is completely honest. I have a great deal of sympathy for them, because they're bombarded by a nationalist narrative that excludes any possibility of contradiction. And by the time you run into somebody on some podcast somewhere saying, hey, maybe the Palestinians are people, you have so many defenses built in from all of that rhetoric that you've heard that you can't process it. It's like somebody telling you the world is flat. You're just like, what the fuck? No, I got a globe in my house. It can't be flat. You can't wrap your head around it.
Yeah. And that's so to give you an example of that, where you're talking about. Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say But
It's you. You go. We're still figuring this out.
We're all still figuring this flow out. I love
Sorry.
it. I love it. I knew this was going to happen.
Yeah.
No, go for it. Go for it. No, go
No,
for
I
it.
was
Go
I
for
was
it.
just
Great.
saying that I mean, I grew up in the post 9/11 world. I mean, I joined a special operations unit. I had a lot of complicated, problematic ideas, to say the least, at that time. This was years and years ago. Still, I don't understand how someone makes the bridge between being indoctrinated and because I thought like Islam was an inherently violent religion. I grew up as a white kid in Texas.
Yep.
After 9/11.
Sure, yeah.
I don't see how someone makes the leap as someone who's like fought on the ground between, okay, I'm indoctrinated and I have a bunch of problematic ideas too. Yeah, I'm just going to be cool with shooting kids just for sport because that's actually what's happening. And I know we had our own sociopaths, but this seems to be completely institutional and completely systemic.
No, see, that's the thing. There's so many interesting studies of this, both in terms of the social psychology of it, as well as historical examples. And on some level, you can even take some of this stuff back into like evolutionary anthropology and really think about how we can be conditioned to view outsiders. So from the very beginning, in terms of our tribal inheritances, we're conditioned to look for certain symbols of an in-group. I see a symbol around your neck that says you're one of my tribe. I've never met you before, but here you can share my water. I don't know who you are. You have this other symbol. I don't trust you. And then my group says you're an enemy. I can attack you. That people have been hitchhiking on that for millennia now. And when you look at modern state structures and the kinds of pervasive propaganda we can hit, it takes it to a whole new level. It's a conscious misuse of that tribal wiring that makes us so much more violent in a sense. Look at, so a really good example here. Pardon me. So again, I'm not only Jewish, not only a historian, I teach comparative genocides, so I do teach the Holocaust. So there's a great study of a reserve police battalion in Germany, right? These are 40-year-old reserve cops. They're not military. They're not SS. They're not hardened killers. But they're drafted. Their country needs them, sends them to the east into the general government area, and then the further east into the Soviet territories. And while they're there, they're asked by some people, "We need you to go with us to this village here, to the shtetl, and shoot these Jews." Right? And do I have any volunteers? I can't force you to do that. And people are like, what the fuck? What do they do? Are they military? Are they a threat? Most people are like, no. But one person says, sure. And the next time, two people say, okay. And it just becomes normalized. And as soon as you start doing it, as soon as you're there and you've made someone dig his own grave and put a bullet in the back of his head, you kind of become inured to it in a sense, and you start telling yourself lies. Our brains are designed to create fictions to motivate us, to give us a sense of meaning and purpose, right? So if I can tell myself my society needs me, this feels like it might be bad, but it's not, because in the long run, I'm a hero because I'm saving my people. If I don't kill this child will grow up into a terrorist, and that terrorist might kill somebody's sister. So I am doing the world a favor by getting rid of them now. So all of the pain, the anger, the distrust you might have in yourself, you can wash away in the act of doing it. But doing that has consequences. There's a ton of PTSD that comes out of this. There's a ton of fragmentation that's happening in people's minds because they're getting themselves to do it. But at the end of the day, those narratives carry us. And that makes it easy to shoot kids. Whether you're talking about atrocities all around the world, whether you're talking about atrocities thousands of years ago or yesterday, it's always played on the same kinds of fears. If I can tell myself a story that says that this child will grow up to be a threat, I can justify doing it. I mean, the fucking Romans committed genocide against peoples that rebelled against them because they could justify, well, if I don't do this now, they will grow up knowing they were subjugated by my empire and they will attack me. So kill them all.
Pax Romana. Yeah.
Yeah. That was great. I time marked that, what you just said, Doctor. No. That's going to be one of the highlights we're going to put out there, is what you just talked about. It's a great analogy. It's a great parallel. I love
it's just
that.
Psychology, I mean, it's not something about any particular people or group or anything else. It's not something about Jews, Christians, Muslims, and anybody can be manipulated into this. Any ordinary people ordinary people can be gotten to commit atrocities. You know, all those people wielding machetes during the Rwandan genocide. Do you think they all just like woke up one day thinking, you know what, I really want to go full on Texas Chainsaw Massacre? No, they had dehumanizing rhetoric for years, separating the populations and priming people for it to think we have to do this. We have to do this to protect ourselves. This is self-defense. From the perspective of the attackers in the Rwandan genocide, they were defending themselves. That's how a lot of IDF soldiers are going to feeling here. They feel that they're defending themselves. Now, if you try to view this as objectively as you can, there's causal relations. There's a causal chain here, one after another. It's not self-defense, right? But from their perspective, it is. And that's all that matters psychologically. And we have to be at least sympathetic to that if we're going to solve the problem. Because if you go around saying, you're all just hardened Nazis or something, like you're just fundamentally genetically wrong, like that doesn't work. We have to help them. Their heads.
That's what I've been saying, is that we have to approach this from a psychologist perspective. There's a lot of geopolitical and ideological debates around this. And there's, of course, the moral aspects of it. This is wrong, but we need to start including this psychological aspect of what's happening so that we can understand it better. Because if we can attack it in the psychology, we can dismantle it. And it can create this. We can actually find like, go ahead.
While acknowledging that's going to be very difficult for a lot of people, especially after this.
Honestly, it is virtually impossible, but still necessary. So it's a tight bind we're in. And I'll give you an interesting way of looking at this, right? So people are often wondering, they're questioning, why is it that that Germany is so against the Palestinians, and why is it the Britain is, and the US? And why are we like so hardcore pro-Israel that we cannot tolerate a Palestinian narrative or ever acknowledge their right to self-defense, only a Jewish one, right? The reason is it's not what people think it is. The reason is technically a kind of anti-Semitism, but not the way people twist the word. Because, again, anti-Semitism only applies to Jews. When people try to like expand the word, they're still playing with like 19th century race science. It's bogus. It was literally invented as a fake word to keep hating Jews without being Christian. So set that aside. They're being anti-Semitic because what they're doing is they're deflecting onto Israel all of the responsibility for their own past hates and crimes, rather than the self-examination, the psychology of it, rather than Germans having to realize, you know what? We have a racist fucking culture. You know what? Our Christian background means that we reflexively hate Jews and Muslims. You know what? We have a real problem we have to deal with. Instead of looking inside, they say, you know what? We did a terrible thing at this one point, so we're going to make up for that by always defending that person. But because you don't do the real self-examination, because you don't understand the ideology and the psychological dimensions of this, they can't see that they're actually doing exactly the same fucking thing. They're defending ethno-nationalist atrocities, which is about as big an example of how you failed to learn the lesson of the Holocaust as it gets. I mean, they got all the wrong lessons from it. I mean, just like the Zionist right took the wrong lesson from the Holocaust, never again for us instead of never again for anybody, the Germans did too, and so did the Brits, and so did the Americans, because our country is racist as fuck to its core. This country is deeply anti-Semitic, and rather than dealing psychologically with that, our social psychology, examining the ideology, examining, quite frankly, Christianity, to see where are these elements coming from? Why do people hold them so closely? Why is it so hard to get rid of? Instead of doing any of that work, we just say, we're going to support Israel, and that gives us a clean slate. That forgives our sins. It's not doing the work. And if we can't do that work, how the fuck can you expect the Israelis to do it? It's going to be very difficult to get them to recognize that, because we don't. The United States has never learned the lessons from its settler colonialism. We still don't apologize for shit. It took the Germans 100 years to apologize for their Herero genocide. It took them to, I think, the late 80s or early 90s to admit that they massacred the Roma in the Holocaust. I mean, they're just like, no, the Roma were actually criminals. They were only in those camps because they were criminals. Like, no, dude, you're still using racism. Like, they were in the 60s and 70s, they wouldn't let people with non-German blood have citizenship still. After World War II, we let them write laws that were explicitly fucking racist and didn't question that at all. That's the core
Yeah.
problem here, is we never examined our own ideology. So how the fuck can we lecture the Israelis on this point? We're not in a moral position to do so.
Not only that, but like we're getting more and more revisionist. Like, have you seen what's passing the Florida school boards for textbooks right now? And in Texas, I'm in Texas right now.
And in Texas,
it's
yeah,
atrocious. It's implying that slavery is a choice.
Yeah, it's all your lost cause shit all coming. I mean, that shit never went away because we never did the hard looking. We forced certain changes in response to certain events. So a particular bad thing happens. Okay, we have to not do that bad thing because people criticized us for that. But you don't look at the ideological structures. You don't look at the core beliefs in psychology that made it possible. And when we can't do that, we cannot prevent atrocities like this. They will keep happening over and over again. And I love that people are paying attention to what's happening in Ukraine and in Palestine, but 7 million people killed in the Eastern Congo, no one batted an eyelash. No one's paying attention to the Rohingya. No one's paying attention to the fact that the Tibetan genocide is well underway. Like, I mean, they're already outnumbered in their own capital. You know, I mean,
the Armenian genocide at the hands of the Azerbaijanis.
Well, yeah, again, so, yeah, there's a massive ethnic cleansing there. The two states were fighting, and the people lost. They just happen to live there, you know, like, but they, like 90% of them have lost their homes now and have been evicted, and we just completely ignore it. There's tons of issues we don't pay attention to because the problem is we don't look at the causes. We don't look at the core ideologies. And there will be no possibility of solving the Israel-Palestine conflict unless we really deal with the actual ideological structures. Why did it happen this way? You know, and we're still empowering that because we have the same basic wiring.
Yeah.
It's really fucked up. I mean, it's sad and depressing. You know, I'm sympathetic to people on all sides of this. You know, I'm stuck in a weird position where, you know, I love Palestinians, I love Israelis, I love human beings. I think all of our political ideas are fucking stupid. You know, like they defy all possible reason and morality, but they make sense that they evolved in a certain way. Like why they happened that way, we get that. But what do you do about it now? How do you change that? You have to. It gets back to your question before. Like, what do we do about it? You know, you have to cause that self-examination to take place somehow. We have to really deal with our own shit. And if we can't do that, if we haven't dealt with the Native American genocide, and we're how many centuries after this? I mean, the Turks can't still deal with like they massacred Armenians, Syriacs, Greeks, you know, like Chaldeans. Like they can't deal with that shit now. Just like they can't deal with the fact what they're doing to the Kurds. You know, no one wants to talk about this shit. I just read an article the other day talking about, like, you know, in the partition of India, a couple 100,000 people died. I'm like, bro, it's like a couple of million. I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? You know, like, it's like holy shit. Like, how do you?
And that's coming off the back of like the Bengal famine too. That entire, like dismantling of the Raj was brutal.
Yeah, we ignore so much. And the reason we ignore it is that to face it, to look it in the eyes, is to look at ourselves and question who we are. No one wants to be the bad guy. The Nazis didn't think they were the bad guys. The Americans have never. And this is anti-imperialism. We're never the bad guys. We can't do that.
And that's what bothers me, especially in the when I talk to the pro-Israel side or Israelis who are, you know, on board with what's going on, is that they get very defensive when we talk about the history of like where Israel was in the wrong. And this is something, and what I try to give them, here's how I try to explain it to them. I'm like, look, I'm American. I come from colonists. My ancestors were one of the original colonists. If I had a stranger come up to me on the street and said, your country did this to the Native Americans, your ancestors did this, your people did that, you know what I would say? I'd be like, yeah, we did that. I'm not denying that. It was wrong. It was fucked up. I didn't do it, but they did it, and I'm acknowledging that. It's no skin off my back. It's not personal to me. They're not attacking me. They're attacking my country. So why would I get defensive about it? I'll just be honest. Be like, yes, but it's owning that when you talk about the actions of a government, this idea that you have to own that as a personal thing, where it's like, you're talking about my people. You're talking about my people this way. It's like, no, I'm not talking about your people. We're talking about the government. Your government has nothing to do with it. So it's like but again, I'm coming from an American's perspective here, where we trash our government all the time in our rhetoric, and that's what I love about this country is that we talk shit. That's one of my favorite things about America, to brag a little bit, is that we love talking shit about our own country and our government. It's part of the American way. That's what's beautiful about it.
But ask the MAGA crowd to do that, and they can't.
No, they can't.
They still can't.
No.
For them, they still want
love it or leave it.
They just like they want to like push all the migrants out. Close the borders, all this shit. They've learned nothing at all.
Razor wire, the Rio Grande,
To give you a oh my God, and that they're fighting to keep that there. Like you want to talk about justifying the death of children? They're literally saying children should die caught on razor wire, and that's good. Like, what the fuck is that? How is that any different from what you're talking about with the IDF soldiers? It's a psychology. Now, one of the ways you can look at this and criticisms of states, because at the end of the day, this is a question of identity. That's where the problem is. It's the nation state model. So all this goes back to the invention of nationalism as a modern political ideology. Countries have existed for a long fucking time. States have been around for ages, right? But the state you always understood was just, they taxed you, they drafted you, they didn't do a damn thing for you. You never thought the state is your friend, and you didn't connect it part of your identity. Your identity was local. So the French state has been there since the 5th century. But the French state had speakers of Breton and Provençal and Gascon and Picard, and like tons of different cultures and languages and local identities that had nothing to do with you didn't identify with the state as the main source of your own sense of self, right? When you create nation states and tell people that a particular identity that you have connects to power, now it's hard to criticize power, because if I criticize the actions of the government, I'm criticizing myself, and
right, exactly.
And I'm invested in it. And the more you're invested in that, one of the problems with Zionism is not that there's something fundamentally different about it, but that it literally reflects the same 19th century nationalisms that spread around the world. It's just tying it into the history and identity of a people and saying the actions of that government are that people and vice versa. So how do you break away from that? If I criticize the actions of the state, I'm actually criticizing you as a person. That's why Turks have a hard time dealing with the Armenian issue. Because the Turkish Republic was founded using exactly the same radical Turkish nationalism as the late Ottoman Empire. They adopted it as their ideology. They are literally different governments. The Turkish government did not commit those atrocities at all. But they won't admit to them because of the ideology. The nationalism is the same, so they connect it still to their sense of identity. If you say that we did this, then Turks did it, and that means I did it, and you're delegitimizing me, and you can't let that shit go.
Yeah, and you know what? Here's to give a little silver lining around this, though. I want to add some positivity in this. Is I don't want to be doom and gloom that this is going to be a permanent fixture of humanity. We are seeing in front of us, you being one of the examples, Doctor, about the movement in this, and this is why I don't think you fully understand your significance in the role of all this dialogue. I don't think you fully grasp it, and that's okay. I'm on the outside looking in. I can see you. And Greg too. Greg doesn't understand the impact he's having either. I don't think he fully comprehends it, but I do. And I'm saying that we are seeing in real time this shift happening finally through social media, through these lives that you do. We are seeing the psychology disintegrate. We're seeing the structures of what you're talking about, this nationalism. We are starting to internalize. We are starting to reflect. We are starting to reflect on these little fabrics that are, they're getting loosened up out of the interwovenness that we've solidified it in our humanity. So I'm seeing a change happening, and it's happening before our eyes. So that's the positive aspect I can say about this, is that I think I was talking to Greg before you got on, is that this idea that the victors write the history books, right? That was true for a long time, that the victors did write the history books until now.
Technically hasn't been true for about 100 years, because my profession is national. Peer review scholarship writes history books. What's different is that history as an academic discipline and history as nationalist propaganda are different things. Yeah. And what people often call history is what your video playing. He's not using history. That's national myth. Yeah. And national myth is a distinctly different thing.
But here's the key. Here's the key: is that the national myth took the center stage, the limelight, because the forms of media were very it's a single point of failure. Like they were canalized into different like media, like newspapers, radio, and TV. You control those three. 50 years ago, 40 years ago, you controlled the world. But now with the internet, the limelight has been taken off these main modes of communication, and it's spread out throughout the internet. So anybody like you and me, our video can go viral and they'll see it like, oh shit, I was wrong about the history. So that's what I meant with it.
Yeah, there's a yes but that I want to put on there, but I want to make sure we understand that I'm actually optimistic too. I know you are. I generally, one thing that you learn when you talk about history over the long delay, not short term, because I teach the ancient and modern worlds. They're my two main areas. And I like to look at the connections between them and the evolution of the ideas within them. And the one thing you can see when you look over history over the long period of time is that change is inevitable. Literally nothing stays the same. If I'm pointing to nationalism as the core causative factor of so many problems today, then all you have to do is note that nationalism didn't exist until the French Revolution. It slowly built up over the couple of centuries before then, little pieces of ideas, finally achieved a mature form at the very beginning of the 19th century, and then it's been around there. So we've got 200 years of it. It's not inevitable. It's not all of our history. It's not been around forever. An idea that can be created at one moment can be dismantled in another. It's a long-term process. It took a while to build up in the first place. It took a while to take off and to impose itself on the world. It will take a while to get rid of. But the core here is, one thing that a lot of people see, and I see this from a lot of activists, they're going to point to all the videos and people talking about the atrocities and dismantling the narratives. All that is great. But it's still, from my perspective, it dances on the surface. Because we can talk about the atrocities of any number of governments. You can reveal Soviet atrocities, Chinese atrocities, Nazi atrocities, American atrocities. You can point to tons of horrifying shit, and people can say, that was wrong, and the government lied, right? The Gulf of Tonkin incident was bullshit. Okay, now I know that, and you can learn that. But if you don't challenge the fundamental ideology, then you do it again and again and again. Did we learn from the Gulf of Tonkin incident? No, because were we in Iraq? Yes. We didn't learn the lesson because we didn't critique the core ideology and the social psychology of it. We only talked about the incidents, and that's my fear. My fear as a historian looking at this and seeing this happening over and over and over again in the last century is that we only look at the specifics and make progress there and ignore the actual core issues. And then it just repeats again ad nauseum. So I'm optimistic overall, but not in the same way you are.
Right. That's okay.
Yeah, I think what's going to happen is, the White House is already starting to position to throw Netanyahu and probably some of his ministers under the bus potentially in the future, and then just be like, oh, couple bad apples, time to move on.
Yeah.
And ignore the fact that the entire the barrel itself is rotten, and if the barrel's rotten, then the apples themselves are getting contaminated. So you can throw all kinds of good new fresh apples in it. If the barrel itself is diseased, you're fucked. And that's the problem. Is the ideological container. The core structures we have of the modern world, the nation state and capital are our problems. If we don't examine the way these ideologies are connected, they're the causative factor of so much of it. As long as we can't have those conversations, then this shit will happen again. That's the sad thing about being a historian, I'll tell you, is we watch the same shit happening over and over and over again because people won't learn the core lessons. They only dance on the surface. And right now, most pro-Pali activists are dancing on the surface. We're not really dealing with the core issues here. If we can shift the narrative, if we can make sure that our side does not take on a lot of problematic rhetoric, we can avoid the anti-Semitism and all the rest of this shit here because all that's fucked up too. If we can find a way to look more positively toward a shared future, great. All that's great. But at the end of the day, we still have to critique the underlying structures. Why do I point to, say, a unitary state as the only real solution? Because it's anti-nationalist. Because if you can admit that Palestinians and Israelis, as well as the minorities like your Circassians and Bosnians and Samaritans and everybody else, if you say they all have a right to live there, that they all are equals, that they all deserve the same dignity and respect on the land, then you're setting aside ethno-nationalism. You're making a positive step toward real change. what we have to do is focus that way. And it's hard because I really understand why anti-colonial nationalism exists. I understand why Palestinian nationalism is so important. But at the same time, as long as it's a nationalist movement, it allows itself to commit atrocities as well. And there's a very bad record in the second half of the 20th century of post-colonial states that adopted nationalist movements during their struggle, committing atrocities later against minorities in their own countries, because they adopted the same rotten barrel from the Europeans and just threw out a couple of bad apples. Oh, the colonizers are bad. Barrel's still rotten, man. Like we have to be able to do that. If we can shift the focus to those, if we can start talking about nationalism as the problem and really help people understand what it is and why it hurts, if we can get past that, so many of the world's problems can be unpicked a bit at a time. But we haven't even started that process. It's not happening. These discussions are not common, and I want them to be common.
Well, I will tell you a discussion that I was on a TikTok live. It was a lot of people on the panel, a lot of pro-Palestinians and a lot of Palestinians. And the common theme of that whole conversation was exactly what you said. They need a one-state solution where everybody's equal, with of course the necessary caveat that all the injustices that were done, all the people who have committed atrocities, they're held accountable.
Sure, yeah.
We get rid of the rotten apple. But I'm going to tell you something. It was a very enlightening live that I was on, and it was down the road that you're saying. So these conversations are happening
yes.
a lot, and they're getting more common. I am seeing them get more common.
That's what I said. I am hopeful.
They are.
But I'm going to tell you, we're at the very beginning of this process, because it goes so much beyond any individual issue too. Focusing on Israel-Palestine, honestly, it's a really interesting vehicle for this whole process, because it's such a deeply entrenched conflict. You've got 150 years of history in it now, and you have very deep roots in the land for the peoples, going back thousands of years. So it's a significant part of people's identity. If we can get people to see beyond the flawed ideologies in this case, how much easier would it be for us to deal with things like Catalonia and Balochistan and the Kurds and everywhere else? Like, find a way to move forward, to really deal with justice towards peoples that have been oppressed and whatnot. Like, there's real opportunities here, to build on. They're happening.
They could create a model.
We're at the very beginning of a long-term process, and
something we have to remind ourselves is that, or at least I do, because I've been so invested in this from the start. Most people are completely not in this conversation at all.
Yeah,
most people are just going about their lives, especially in America. They're like, oh, it's the Middle East. Like, I hope Israel's okay, but this is what happens in the Middle East, So I think that's the limit, and so starting to get the independent voters who are not like hardened Zionists and who are just kind of on the fence, just been like living their normal lives. I think that's the real play. But then again, getting people out of their privilege and complacency is inherently difficult.
Making it real for them, and I think the way you can make it real is, again, focus on those core ideologies. Because if somebody doesn't have a real reason to care about Israelis or Palestinians, they've never encountered it. They're not Christian. They're not Jewish. They have no horse in this race, right? How do you make it alive for them? Talk about the real causative issues. Start talking about nationalism, because that is a problem in this country. If you can connect white nationalism and Christian nationalism in this country to what's happening in Israel-Palestine, it becomes real for people. If you can say MAGA and like Geert Wilders and like the Marine Le Pen and like all this shit happening, like Vladimir Putin. Oh, people love to hate on Putin. Cool. Let's throw Putin in there, right? If you can talk about all that shit and say it's the same fucking problem, then you give them a way to relate to it. Maybe they already care about the Ukraine-Russia issue. Cool. Piggyback on that and help them see beyond the specifics to the actual underlying issue. So I love that you point about generalities. It's not generalities. It's the specifics in a sense. It's actually going to the core of it. I just use as a metaphor. I'll often say we're often whacking the fruit off the tree. We're taking our machete and whacking off the fruit or the branches, and we ignore the trunk and the roots. We never talk about the roots. As long as you don't touch the roots, that shit's going to grow back. The fruit will be there next year. I can knock off as many apples as I want. That shit's all going to grow back next year until I take care of the roots. The root is nationalism and capital. And we're starting those conversations in activist spaces again, which is great. But you look at the kind of activism that existed in the 1960s in the US, and they're light years ahead of what we have now in terms of the awareness of people of the structural factors of capital and imperialism and nationalism. They understood that shit better than most activists do now. We're still too much in our own heads. We haven't really done enough of that work. But there's a start in the activist spaces to make the kind of discussions you're saying, and that's great. Build on that. And then if you want to keep expanding this movement, focus on those roots, because you can make connections for people then to issues that are important to them in their lives, right? You can make it real.
Absolutely. Well, I just wanted to say that we're almost at the 2-hour mark, Gaz.
Yeah. Oh,
No worries.
I have to meet a friend, so
yeah,
I should wind up.
No worries.
So I think it's
a great place to end on, and we want to thank you so much for your time and coming on with us today for our inaugural episode.
Yeah, Doctor, before you go, real quick, when can we have you on next?
I don't know. I keep it. Write to me and I'll look at it. I'll put some times out. We'll
now
as long as I can make time fine, like this month is bad. I have a lot of stuff still going on this month. People have already filled it up pretty well. But by middle of next month, things are really clearing up again. I'm free to plan things in. If you want multiple hours and we can have like nice in-depth discussions, let's plan something. We'll meet next month or something. But
okay, excellent. And in the meantime, how can people follow you? What's your handle on TikTok?
Oh, I'm all over the place on the social media, and it's always the same. So Liam O'Mara IV, so LiamOmaraiv, and it's the same on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Threads, Mastodon, Twitter /X, whatever, like freaking everything.
Yeah.
I think you used to be able to search me that way easily on YouTube too, but the technical YouTube channel, like you said, is Office Hours with the Mad Professor. A friend of mine named it.
Okay.
I ran with that. I was like, yeah, that's a cool handle. I'll use it. But Liam O'Mara IV is me everywhere.
Okay, great. Thanks. We'll post that in the description.
We're gonna put that in there. Now, one technical note, Doctor. So this the way this platform is working is what we're recording right now is downloading locally onto your computer, and then it's gonna upload to the cloud so that we get the highest quality video footage. So when we're done, don't close this tab. You're gonna see a download section. It's uploading to the cloud. So if you could leave the tab open. And just let it go and do its thing and upload to the so we have a nice.
Doing it on your end.
It's doing it on my end on the cloud, but I'm getting the internet quality. So the local quality is down
for my video specifically, and you knit them together later.
Yeah. Exactly. So if you could just leave this, so it's going to be a lot bigger quality audio cool. Or in video.
And like, what is it? Greg, like your video is actually like frozen several times too, so hopefully your local is better.
Yeah, that's fine. It'll be. We'll fix it in post production.
Yeah. So it's good that it works that way. That's great.
So 1 second, I want to give a quick monologue on you. So just to kiss your ass a little more if I can. So Dr. O'Mara, I see you in your rise to hold on. Let me be poetic a little bit. I see you in your rise to I see you in your rise to fame among social media warriors as a symbol of a sign of your time. You have a comical and very relatable way of going about educating people in history and societies past and present. You use relatable analogies very effectively in explaining history to young people, and your style of doing so is very unique and palatable. You represent, in my opinion, the coming of a new age, an age of nuance in which people no longer think in black and white generalities, tribalistic dogma, and nationalistic madness, but rather an era in which the obsession of society is now focused on the details, the nuance, the complexities, and neglected facts which have been screaming to be discovered and taken interest in. So that's it. That's my monologue. Okay, I hope you like it.
Thanks. I mean, it's cool. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't take myself very seriously. So while
shut up, Craig,
I can acknowledge. Okay,
I'm literally not saying anything.
You're
making faces.
From students. Okay, yeah. So I do all right. But at the end of the day, I'm a blathering autistic, asshole who likes to swear up a storm. I'm just me.
We love it.
Excellent.
It's just if it works for somebody, great. I'm not gonna say it shouldn't, but I'm never going to take myself very seriously. So it's still kind of like, oh gosh, really?
Your audience does. That's why they love you.
Yeah.
Your audience.
Well,
definitely does.
they're
As long as they run with their own lives.
you got both barrels.
Yeah, my goal
You got
is
both
to
barrels
get
just
people to
out
think
of
for
the
themselves and to then take these things into their own lives and do something with it. Like I don't want to be anybody's leader. I want to inspire people to then do their own shit, organize, like, keep learning on your own, care about things. If I do that for anybody, as far as I'm concerned, all the time is worth it,
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. All right, gentlemen, we're gonna close this first inaugural episode. Hopefully, it's
Yes,
listenable.
sir.
I mean, you are great. Thank you very much.
This
And,
is it.
yeah,
This
leave
is
the tab
our first
open,
one.
We'll go.
All right.
All
leave
right.
leave your tabs open, guys. Leave your tabs open when we end this.
All righty.
Got
Have a
it.
good
All right. All right. Take care. Take care.
Fun.
Brother. All right. Let's end this thing. Ending recording.
And